Welcome back to another episode of Cape Ann Today. We are talking to Gab Watling, the storyteller-in-residence at the Gloucester Writers Center, and we're talking about the upcoming Fishtail performance, December 8th. For those who don't know, Fishtail invites people to create and read their personal story based on a suggested theme. The theme for December 8th is Ancestors. Gab, tell us why Ancestors makes for a good story.
Everybody has them. I have become increasingly convinced over the course of the year that we are our stories. That is what makes us. We're making stories while we're alive, and when we go, it's stories that we leave behind. And ancestor stories, everybody has an ancestor story. They range from, the positively delightful to the positively grisly, but they're compelling. We share them, and they can lead us to bigger concepts and bigger ideas as well, because they're personal, but they connect us to things like shared historic past, culture, identity, the sort of huge concepts that are really important to us today.
Hmm.
Gab, I can tell from right off the bat that you're not from the fort. So, where are you now, and how did you get here? And a bit about your background, please.
Okay, right. So no, it's true. I'm not from Cape Ann. I'm from Beverly, but as you can tell, I'm not even from Beverly. I'm from Australia. So yes, I've been here for over 20 years. So I'm a citizen. I consider myself a local. I hear American accents in the way that I would hear Australian accents if I was in Australia. I hear American accents as my own. I think I'm speaking in an American accent, but of course I'm not. And every now and again, somebody reminds me, hang on, who the hell are you?
So let's follow up and give us, it was not fair of me because I know you, Gab. So tell our listeners, how you came to become a Beverly resident involved in the Gloucester Writers Center.
Okay, right, goodness. When I finished my graduate studies in Australia, and Australia is an enormous country geographically, but a very small country in terms of population. We have many fewer universities and colleges of higher education in Australia than the United States has. I knew that in my field of, English literature, post-colonial literature, I wasn't going to get a full-time job in Australia. There just aren't the jobs available. I knew that I would have to leave Australia if I wanted to pursue a professional career. And I chose Mexico first because I had a cousin there in Mexico City who was, going to welcome me to the city and sort of help me connect with the college network there, which I did. And I loved Mexico, and I made wonderful Mexican friends. But for whatever reason, I could not learn Spanish. I could not become fluent in Spanish. And unless you're happy to stay dependent on people who do speak Spanish, you really do need to be fluent in the national language. So I was working for an organization that had a campus in Mexico City, but was based in Beverly, Massachusetts. And of course, that organization being Endicott College. And I asked my employers in Mexico City, would it be at all possible for me to move to up to Massachusetts and begin work up there? And it was so lucky that was the very moment that Endicott was expanding like crazy, and so I was scooped up by the giant Dr. Wiley, and I've been at Endicott ever since, and of course was a Beverly resident right from the start. And then in 2006 the magnificent Charlotte Gordon came to work at Endicott College. And although I knew Gloucester was a beautiful place, a wonderful location in New England, and that Cape Ann was far superior to that other Cape, I didn't know anybody in Gloucester until I met Charlotte. And then when you meet Charlotte, you know everybody in Gloucester. So that's how I met Phoebe and Layla and Heather. And in terms of Fishtails and Gloucester Writers Center, I guess it was mostly Phoebe and Layla, because they had both been storytellers in residence as well. And so when Layla finished her time as storyteller in residence, she handed the hook on to me. So it's a long story, but you asked for it.
No, I think it gives us all context. So what have you learned, and maybe you knew this already, about what makes a good story? I mean, we all have ancestors, but do we all have a good story from our ancestors?
Yes.
And what makes a good storyteller? Yeah.
It's an excellent point. Yes, everybody has a good story in them, but sometimes it takes a bit of encouragement and training to help that person turn that story into a story. There are stories that you can tell at the Thanksgiving table, which will probably last 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute before somebody interrupts and takes the story in another direction, or the house burns down or whatever. But when you're presenting a story at Fishtails, you need to craft it into a full 5-minute narrative. And this is not actually a natural storytelling approach for human beings. It's rare that we get 5 minutes to tell a story uninterrupted the way that we want to tell it. And so as the storyteller in residence at Fishtails, I've concentrated on streamlining my workshop, the workshop that I do with the next lot of storytellers, to help them turn a family legend or an idea into a full, rich 5-minute narrative that has all the sort of rhetorical markers that the audience will recognize. It needs to have a clear beginning. It needs to have context. It needs to have characters. It needs to have stakes. This is the thing that was taught to me by Layla Goodman. There needs to be something at stake. It can't just be a sort of a slight surface observation about something amusing that happened. For an audience to really understand what the story means to you and why you've carried it around for this long, there needs to be something that is maybe threatened, or something that is maybe born of the story, a lesson, a lifelong lesson that has been learned, or some aspect of family history that the family has come to live by. So crafting a story is, yes, very, very different from spontaneously telling a story at the family table.
So Gab, as you're speaking, it reminds me of like crafting a stand-up routine where you're putting together 5 minutes. So now how do you go from being a writer to a public performer? Because for those who aren't familiar with Fishtails, the writer is basically in front of a room full of folks telling their tale.
That's true. And I have to admit, I'm not, sorry, Heather.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, how far is stand-up comedy from a fishtail?
It can be the same thing. Although we run a fabulous thing at Endicott, a stand-up show every year, usually involving women comedians of color. And they do a Q&A afterwards. And I was very interested at the last show to ask them how they put their routines together. And they seem to rely on the sort of joke by joke method of occupying the stage. So theirs is not a single narrative. It's context, punchline, context, punchline, context, punchline, with maybe a little bit of transition between each thing. And their aim is to keep the audience laughing, to keep the audience, sort of laughing at every punchline as it comes along. The storytelling technique is not exactly that same thing, because it needs to be the same story for the whole 5 minutes. And it doesn't necessarily need to end on a punchline. It does need to end, but it doesn't need to necessarily have a punchline. So I was very interested to compare the way they craft their routines to the way that I've been instructing people to craft stories. But certainly, I think I'd have to say that the most successful stories I've seen have been ones that do end with, a walk-off line, a line that makes the audience go,
yeah, the proverbial mic drop, right?
Yes.
So then, Gab, so then what's it like going from a story writer to storyteller?
Right, right. I think I've been using both techniques because I wrote a lot of my family stories before anybody asked me to stand up and tell any stories live. So I had miles of time to write stories. Stories went on for pages and pages and had casts of characters and cul-de-sacs and highways and parking lots. You can't do that as a storyteller. So I would, according to the theme of the night, I would come up with a story that, you know, connected with that theme, and then I'd shape it. But I'd write it first. So I'd write it out, and then I'd read it and time myself and discover that it took me, you know, 15 minutes to read this thing that I thought was like that. And then I sculpt it from there down to something that contains the elements of the story, but still just occupies the 5 minutes.
Interesting.
So you don't have to be a writer to be a storyteller, and you,
No.
right? Yeah.
No, I mean, I write my stories, but I'm sure that there are storytellers who are regulars at Fishtails who don't write their stories.
So I think a lot of people are familiar with The Moth, which is a similar, platform. And The Moth is national and it's incredibly popular. People love it. So has storytelling met its hour, do you think? Is it something about this time and place in our history or our culture's history that we need storytelling? What do you think?
Yes, that's an excellent point. Maybe public storytelling has found its moment, because I think Homo sapiens have always clustered around stories, but they've probably been ritualized stories, and there has been space made within the smaller culture, the family unit, the tribal unit, etc., for storytelling time. Everybody knows everybody in the family. So the stories that get told in the family are stories that sort of already have a context, already have, and people are expecting those stories to be told. To be telling personal stories in the public arena, that's a bit of a different thing. But I think you may be right about that style of storytelling, that Moth Fishtails type of storytelling having a moment, because I'm seeing in the newspapers, in the sort of media commentary and what have you, more and more reference to people telling stories. So, and I mean, as we know, these are unusual times. I think we have realized that we need to connect at the story level. We desperately need to share each other's points of view, to hear from those who are not related to us by blood or precise geographic location, street, neighborhood, next door, schoolroom, whatever. We need to hear those perspectives.
Well, I think I'm going to comment also. I think there's something different. I mean, we all go to movies. We watch movies, obsessively, and that is a storytelling form. But there's something very different about on a person's actual story, and I think it's the relatability, maybe. That
it could be. It could be
a little bit more.
Yeah, because when I think about audience reaction, it's what you're hearing is relatability. It's people turning to their neighbors. At Fishtails, you can't really see the audience. The light is so bright, but you sense people turning to their neighbors and going, "Oh my gosh, that's so right. That happened to me." Or laughing, to connect with, the sort of the moment that amuses. Yes, I think it's the sort of sense of I'm hearing something similar to my own experience. I'm recognizing a link here. I'm recognizing a shared cultural moment here. Yeah.
And we're speaking about the event happening December 8th now at 7:30 p.m. at Gloucester Stage Company, presented by the Gloucester Writers Center. And so, Gab, what can people expect that night? When you go in, it's a series of speakers talking about, and the topic is ancestry or ancestors?
The topic is ancestors. There are I want to say 8 storytellers. I'm not telling a story on that particular night. I am the MC though, so whoever goes, I'll be there. You'll see a lot of me. And the stories will be personal stories. I haven't heard a lot of the stories. I've only heard 1 or 2, so I know that some of them are just sort of the generation back plus the speaker's generation. I get the sense though that some of them are from generations sort of in the past. So stories that have been handed down from generation to generation about that particular family. So I introduce each storyteller individually, and on they come and they tell their story. And at the end of the night, because we've got to the end of the season, I'll be handing the fishhook over to the next storyteller in residence. So we'll have a little bit of sort of continuity at the end of this particular Fish Tales.
Aha. Now, if people want to learn more about the Writers Center or the show coming on the 8th, or if they want to tell their own tale, how can they go about doing that? Yeah.
Okay. Fish Tales is always looking for storytellers. I don't know if I'm allowed to say who the next storyteller in residence is. I haven't actually discussed that with our Gloucester Writers Center folks. But certainly Gloucester Writers Center, if you just Google Gloucester Writers Center, that will get you to their webpage, and their webpage has all of the details about Fish Tales, what it is, its history, videos from past Fish Tales events, people to contact. So Fish Tales and Gloucester Writers Center, very approachable and very easy to connect with that group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have one last question, Gab.
Sure.
As you walk away from your year as the storyteller in residence, what are you thinking about stories?
It changed my life this year, organizing Fish Tales. I met so many wonderful people. I heard so many fabulous stories. I also heard stories from people who I thought I knew, and I heard stories that I had never heard before. And that made me think about how rich we are as storytelling creatures, that even if we think we have told every story, we still have stories to tell. But it also, because of the family tragedy that we suffered just recently, that made me reflect on how important stories are to every aspect of our lives as well. I lost my father recently, but he was telling stories up until the day he died. And again, we think we know our 90-year-old fathers, and I heard stories that I had never heard before. So unfortunately, I could never get my father to tell a story of Fish Tales. He was several thousand miles away, but my last memories of my father are of him telling fabulous stories.
Oh, nicely said, Gab. She is Gab Watling. Ancestors is at the Gloucester Stage Company Thursday, December 8th, 7:30 p.m. For tickets, go to gloucesterstage.com. If you want to learn more about Fish Tales or the Gloucester Writers Center, go to gloucesterwriters.org. Gab, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.